Okay guys, so I think we'll get started now. We have quite a lot of participants and I don't want to take up too much time. I want to give as much time as possible to the speakers because I'm sure you both have a lot of really interesting things today. So hello to everyone, and my name is Bríd Carroll and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Irish Centre of Social Gerontology, ICSG, at NUI Galway. And I'm the organiser of this seminar series with the support of ICSG. So the ICSG website is where you would have found the extra information and the link to the Zoom information. So that's where any future information will be on that website, icsg.ie. So thanks everyone for joining us here today for the first of 4 online seminars on the topic of emotionally traumatic research. So the goal or the rationale of the seminar series, I think, is just to increase learning about research in which emotionally demanding or emotionally traumatic topics are encountered. And this has been with the objective of making researchers better equipped to deal with these topics for both their own psychological safety, but also for the psychological safety of the research participants. A second key goal is to raise awareness of this issue with institutional powers and to effect positive change. And we've identified 3 key areas where we'd like to see change at an institutional level. So first, we'd like to see the provision of a comprehensive training programme for researchers who will encounter emotionally demanding or traumatic topics. Sorry, I have 2 children here, so one has just piped in, asking me to be quiet. The second goal at an institutional level is the development of a suite of supports for researchers who encounter emotional trauma in their work, including but not limited to a peer support network. And third, the incorporation as standard of commitments to work towards the psychological safety of researchers in ethical approval applications. So for those of us in NUI Galway, this seminar series builds on a reading group series that we ran in the last months of 2020 on this same topic. And the papers that we examined highlighted a number of institutional and methodological challenges of conducting this type of research. So just some examples of the type of challenges that came up in this literature were things like the institutional silencing of these challenges. Another one, which one paper highlighted, was the particular problem of conducting research with perpetrators of trauma as opposed to victims of trauma. So that was just one challenge in one particular paper. And a more recent challenge is that of showing empathy or understanding when conducting research amid COVID-19 restrictions. However, these readings also highlighted some opportunities or specific strategies. So for example, the use of self-reflexive meta-analysis within one's research to assess and improve the process. That was one particular suggestion in one paper. Another opportunity was that researchers could harness their own insider status as someone with personal experiences of the same trauma. And the same paper, I should say, also marked this out as a challenge, as a potential challenge. And the third potential opportunity was the transformative justice doing process of witnessing and recognising participants' experiences. So that although there is a risk of triggering trauma in people when you ask them to speak about it, there's also potentially benefits that can come from you bearing witness to their stories. So the seminars have been designed to hear as wide a variety of knowledge and experiences as possible. So each week we'll hear from an established academic researcher who's experienced in this type of research. Sorry, just a minute. Sorry, I have a 5-year-old who's given out to me because he can't hear his cartoons. Okay, I'll get back to where I was. So they've been designed to hear as wide a variety of knowledge and experiences as possible. Each week we'll hear from an established academic researcher who's experienced in this type of research and who has reflected at least once on this methodological challenge in a publication. And each week we'll also hear the perspective of a different type of actor in this process. Today we'll hear from an early career researcher. Next week, we'll hear the perspective of someone who acts as a gatekeeper to an often traumatized population of people who are frequently the subject of research. In the third week, we'll hear from the head of student counselling in NUI Galway to gain some insight into how research students can be affected by trauma in their work and strategies around this. And in the final week, we'll play host to 2 experienced transcribers, an often forgotten cohort in the process of conducting research, which is emotionally traumatic. So I want to make sure we have as much time as possible to hear these voices. So I'll shortly hand over to our first speaker. But first, some housekeeping. Today, each speaker segment will be 20 minutes long, followed by 20 minutes for the speaker to answer questions. I feel that a Q&A format is probably best rather than an open discussion because we have quite a high number of attendees. I know over 100 people registered for today. If you have a question, please put it in the chat box during the presentation or at the end, and then I'll put the questions to the speaker. And if you really feel the need to add something, you can raise your hand virtually or just on camera and I'll call on you and unmute you. But I probably would like to keep these kind of interactions to a minimum just so we can keep to time as much as possible. And I'll just note as well that the seminar is being recorded and I'm going to upload the recording to the ICSG website afterwards for viewing. So without further ado, I'll now introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Emerita Breen-Smyth. Professor Breen-Smyth is a researcher, writer, victims advocate, public speaker, and Emerita Professor from the University of Surrey, and visiting professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, Singidunum University in Serbia, and the American University of Rome. Her research focus is mainly on war and conflict, terrorism, and political violence, particularly in the Northern Irish context. Professor Breen-Smyth has also published work on the ethical and practical challenges of conducting research in these difficult contexts, and she's a founding editor of the journal Critical Studies on Terrorism. Okay, so I will now mute myself and I'll unmute you, Marie, and you can take it away. You have to unmute yourself, Marie, I think.
Okay, so sorry, can I screen share?
You should be able to, yeah. Down at the bottom, do you see the screen share button?
Yes, I do. So let me just tidy up my screen so you can't see all the terrible things that I get up to when I'm not talking to you guys. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, hang on, slideshow from the start. Just to say that, oh, damn, sorry. Sorry. Of course, that's completely blanked everything out. Oh dear. Sorry.
Okay.
Can you still hear me?
I can hear you. You were cutting out there. I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, that didn't work particularly well. I'm going to screen share. I can't do it in what is it called? Display mode. So I'm going to have to just show you what we can see. So let me screen share now. So let's screen share the desktop. Share. Okay. So let me, that's better. Hang on. Let me just make this bigger. So how about that? Does that look possible?
Yeah, I can read the small writing at least. Yeah, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, that's fabulous. This is a PowerPoint that I've sent to Breen, so anybody who wants it can have it. You don't have to make frantic notes while you're going along. And I've also sent 3 articles to Breen also, which she can share with you. She's going to figure out a way of doing that. So again, some of the material that I'm referring to, you don't have to make frantic notes because the publications on which my remarks are based can be accessed via Breen. So first of all, my brief, which was very broad, I have to say, was that I had to talk about the main methodological, ethical, and theoretical challenges and the implications of this type of research. I had to do something about the structural or institutional challenges or the opportunities. Then I was supposed to talk about the methodological and personal opportunities for this type of research. I've highlighted that in red because I'm not going to talk about it because there just isn't time. And so then the final thing that I was to talk about, which I am going to spend some time on, is the key strategies for researcher self-care and participant care in the face of sensitive research. So that was my brief. I just quickly say my experience of this kind of research, Breen has already covered. I've worked mostly in Ireland, mostly in Northern Ireland, with child soldiers, with both combatants and victims of various kinds of armed conflict. I've also worked with soldiers and police officers who've been disabled. I've also worked in the Middle East with the Palestinian population, and also with refugeniks in Israel, and with ethnic conflict in West Africa, community ethnic conflict in the northern region in Ghana, and also with armed militias in South Africa. So with other victims in South Africa as well. So that's that. Then the other side of it is that I used to shrink heads for a living, in that I have a background in mental health. And I worked as an individual, and then a couples, and then eventually a family therapist, largely in the United States. And I worked there with drug and alcohol misuse, intimate partner violence, and various other issues around that kind of thing. So I brought that already to the work the research that I did. Okay, so then to move on to address some of the things that I've been asked to talk about. And please feel to interrupt me. Bridget, I can't read the chat and talk at the same time, so you can interrupt me on behalf of anybody who raises issues in the chat, if you would, please.
Well, just sorry, one person has said it would be better if Marie went into slideshow mode.
No, I can't do that. That's what I tried to do when I cut out.
Okay.
I understand that it would be better, but it's not possible because my screen is taken over then completely with slideshow, and therefore I can't interact with you. So unfortunately, that's not going to be possible. However, we are making the slides available, and you can look at them in whatever way you want after the talk is over. But please bear with me for now.
They're legible anyway. They're fine as they are.
That's great. So there's nothing more like this is one of the unfortunate things about Zoom. I should have remembered this from teaching on Zoom before, but you can't really do slideshow display, or whatever you call that thing, slideshow mode. Okay, so the main methodological, ethical, and theoretical challenges. So I'm doing this on the back of an envelope. I've written about this, and so if you want to know in more depth and with greater care what I think about this, please read what I've written. And as I say, that's available via Breeding. But essentially, some of the key things that pop up in my head when I talk about this is, first of all, methodologically. And can I just say that for me, ethics and methodology are almost impossibly, you can't really extricate one from the other, because your methods will influence the kind of ethical challenges that you meet, and your ethical challenges will determine to some extent the methodologies that you can and can't use. So I use those two concepts interchangeably, not interchangeably, but they're very close. They're kissing cousins, as it were. And so we really can't speak about one without bumping up against the other, in my view. So you can see immediately, methodologically, how do you do it actually leads you to the question of who do you do it for. So one of the methodological challenges that I face, for example, because I am somebody who wants to change the world. I don't do research for the sake of doing research or satisfying my intellectual curiosity purely, although there is that. I actually want to bring about social change. And I do this because I want the research to be able to be applied to causes and to be presented to, for example, governments and that they can regard it as credible and therefore want to do something about the issue. Now, that means immediately, whether we like it or whether we don't, and I know many of you are qualitative researchers and all the rest of it. I have bad news for the qualitative researchers who are dyed-in-the-wool qualitative researchers. Governments are not impressed by qualitative research. So that's the first thing that you need to really think about, because they want survey results, they want percentages, they want graphs, they want pie charts, they want all of that stuff there. Now, I do that. I was trained originally as a large N social scientist, so I have that capacity. If you don't have that capacity, you might want to pair up with somebody who does, and do a two-pronged approach to your issue if you're interested, like I am, not merely in understanding the world, but also in changing it. Because actually, in terms of policy impact, the evidence is very clear that actually your quants, your graphs, your data, your percentages are what actually impresses your policymakers. So that's the first point to make. And so whatever you feel like doing or what you're comfortable doing may not actually be ethically the best thing to do if, as I say, you're interested in impact. And I think we all ought to be interested in impact for ethical reasons, which I'll come to in a moment. Who is it for? And I mean, some of this also, and I think Breen has referred to this earlier, some of it will be for your respondents because they'll have a vested interest in it and you'll be doing some of it for them. And that will also determine some of the methods that you can use. So for example, some respondents will be happy to be recorded. Some respondents of mine, for example, were happy to be filmed, and we've made a number of films of the work that I've done, because actually a whole lot of the policymakers that I work with won't even look at a graph. They want something that's going to have an immediate emotional impact on them. So we took to film. So basically, who is it for determines methods, but it also then looks at your ethics. So let me jump ahead and say that, you know, basically, if your research is not viable, if it's not going to deliver some kind of reliable, valuable result in terms of science, in terms of knowledge, in terms of taking forward the boundaries of knowledge, which we talk about, then it raises questions about how ethical it is to do it in the first place. If it serves no purpose in terms of advancing knowledge, I would put it to you that ethically it may not be viable. There's no point in doing something simply to satisfy your own intellectual curiosity or to give you something to do on a Friday night. Actually, you need a little bit more than that, and you need to be able to deliver something that is of scientific value or policy value if you're me, ideally both. Okay, so that's kind of tying those two things together. The other ethical consideration, and again, Breen has alluded to this, is the effect that doing the research has. And for those of you who studied social psychology, well, you'll be familiar with the Hawthorne effect in social psychology, which is that, you know, the very act of studying something changes it. So we have to be responsible from the get-go in terms of our gaze on the subject has an impact before we even start doing the research. And so actually understanding that, anticipating what that effect might be or what those effects might be, and factoring that into our ethical audit of the project itself, but also then trying to anticipate the desirable and indeed the undesirable effects that we'll be causing and mitigating the undesirable. And those are, I mean, that's putting it in a nice, clear sentence. But actually, this is the thing that turned my hair gray in the past. These are very troubled and difficult issues to deal with in a field which is already very troubled, where you're dealing with people who have been already through hell backwards and traumatized populations. So, and I mean, the cui bono question, who has something to gain from it? I've always been of the view that where the very bottom line is that we must try to do no harm in terms of delivering the effect of the research on the people we are actually researching. But actually, more than that, we really need to have some kind of benefit for them. And therefore, I'm an advocate of participative action research, which I'll come to in a moment, and we can spend more time, and I'm sure other people will talk about this as well. In other words, that the participants in the research are not merely participants. They become actually co-designers of the research. They become co-researchers on occasion. They certainly become co-analysts of the results, and they actually become co-presenters of the results as well. So that the more involvement they have in the actual design and delivery and the reporting of the research, for me, the better the ethical quality of the research. More than that, we're dealing with populations to whom a great deal of harm done in the past, and their experience of people in positions of power over them have been of being done to rather than being brought along as a collaborator or as an equal partner. So one of the therapeutic values, I think, of doing participative action research is the empowerment and the respect that we bring to our participants in terms of joining with them to see the world through their eyes, to see what we're doing through their eyes, and to be educated by them as we go along. So, so that's, I mean, having said all that, that's all very worthy. We're also entitled as researchers to our you know, our benefits out of that. So there'll be career benefits, there'll be publications, there'll be grants that we get, and so on. So there has to be a benefit to you. I mean, you're not Mother Teresa, for God's sake. So you've got to actually have something in it for you, but there equally needs to be something in it for everybody, for the respondents as well. Now, this is all very easy whenever you're dealing with somebody who fits into the neat category of victim. When you're looking at perpetrators, however, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And I won't have time, that's an extremely complicated issue. I won't have time to deal with that in great detail, but if people have questions about that, because I've also worked with members of armed groups. And I noticed at the very beginning, we talked about the emotional safety of both the participants and the researcher. Can I just add physical safety as well? It's not just a question of emotional safety. Let's not privilege the psychological and ignore the elephant in the room, which is, you know, if you're dealing with people who have access to weapons, if you're dealing with people who have a history of violence, then you need to make sure that you're actually physically safe as well. And if you're working in a war zone, as I often have been, it's a bit like going up a mountain. I mean, I live close to Errigal. If you're going to climb Errigal, you make sure that somebody knows what time you're leaving, what time you're expected back, and who to contact your next of kin and bring your body off the mountain if you don't happen to come back. In many ways, working in dangerous environments has the same kind of rules as going up Errigal. You need to make sure that you've put contingency in place in case something goes wrong. And that you have, I mean, we issued mobile phones to researchers going out into the field so that we could contact them and they could contact us. And so all of that kind of safety stuff, which is psychological, but it's actually also physical as well. And let's not forget that. Okay, then finally, the contribution to knowledge. And I think the contribution to knowledge, but also the policy impact is something that I'll draw attention to. And I mean, quite often, the research that we do is in very popular fields. And I will mention that in the field that we work in here of emotional trauma, we do occasionally get people attracted to this field for the reason of their own psychological disturbance. And we need to be alert to that. I mean, I personally, in Northern Ireland, we've come across a number of people who've shown up claiming to be experts in trauma or various other things, and who have turned out, in fact, to be no such thing. And in fact, in my clinical opinion, have been suffering from some form of Munchausen's. So we just need to be aware that when you're in these kind of areas of work, that not everybody around you is there for a good reason. And not everybody around you is as well put together as you might be. And certainly the vulnerabilities of your own vulnerabilities, but also the vulnerabilities of other people around you are something that has to be brought to the fore. And we can't always trust everything that we hear in these environments, because there are people who manipulate them and who are there for reasons other than the purely ethical and scientific. Okay, so so then
there's 15 minutes gone already. So
oh sweet God,
yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, so I've did some stick drawings earlier, and that's you are you, and R is respondent, and then I did this lovely drawing here, because I think it's quite important to realize that when you're in this transaction with your respondent, that you've got all these other people in the room with you. You've got the government and law, and for a start, let me refer to something that I've written recently about the experience of the Boston College project in Boston, where we now have two respondents from that research project conducted in Northern Ireland, who are standing trial for murder based on the evidence that was collected as part of that research project. Now, if you're not familiar with this case, If you contact Breen or you contact me, I'll send you a paper that I've written about it, because I've published an analysis of the Boston College case at the moment in terms of the ethics and methodology. Very quickly to say, the big flaw in that research design was that the respondents were given guarantees of confidentiality and anonymity. Now, with the best will in the world, I would say none of us are in a position to give guarantees of confidentiality and anonymity. Nobody can guarantee that, because there are laws in place that require us to cough up or to hand stuff over. We are not protected in law, internationally or locally. But also, what's to say that our car isn't burglarized and our materials are stolen, that our internet account is hacked, and so on and so forth. So I think the guarantees that we give people and the way that we represent the risks involved in participating in research are absolutely central to avoiding the kind of disaster that the Boston College project has been. One of the things that they didn't do was they didn't actually take their research through an ethics committee. And I mean, they're a total pain in the ass, and I get that. I used to chair one, and believe me, I can be a complete pain in the ass. But basically, an ethics committee will be the kind of the monkey on your back, if you like. That's a terrible analogy, but it'll be the critical friend or the critical enemy, if you like, asking the awkward questions about your research design. And really, it's some kind of guarantee or some kind of safeguard that you've actually answered all the ethical questions. But these are the other people that are in the room with you when you actually are doing the research. And I just wanted to do that diagrammatically. I'm going to move on quickly, because the other drawing that I did was really in terms of the ethics of what you bring to the research itself. You bring your knowledge, you bring your motivation, you bring your self-awareness and your skills. And that is an interaction with the respondents' history and vulnerability. But of course, that's not the only thing that's in the room, because actually we can add to that your history and your vulnerability, because it could be, for example, that you've been traumatized by precisely the same thing, that the respondent has been traumatized, and that's part of your motivation for doing the work in the first place. But also your respondent, and certainly many of the respondents I've talked to and interviewed, have been very knowledgeable about what they're doing. They're very clear about what their motivation is. Some of the motivation is wonderful. Some of it is less than wonderful, let me tell you. And some people, certainly combatants that I've interviewed, have been very good at embroidering the stories that they have had about their role in certain events, and concealing some of the things that they've actually done. And so triangulation becomes important whenever you're interviewing, particularly combatants or perpetrators. But also your own, they have self-awareness as well, to some degree or other, and they also have skills. And these are things I think that it's very easy to overlook, because we get caught up in the idea that these people are victims and therefore they're not powerful. But actually, there is no, there are very powerful aspects of victimhood that can be deployed politically. And again, one of the readings that I've sent Breen that you can share is I talk about the uses of suffering. And one of the uses of suffering is as political heft. Suffering can be used to justify, for example, further violence. And so we need to be aware of that and just bring that to a more complex analysis of the situation that we're researching. Breen, how am I doing time-wise?
We're at 20 minutes now, so I don't know, do you want to quickly go through the rest of it, or?
Let me see what I can. We're going to share the PowerPoint, so let me see if I can.
A little bit of the discussion time, if you want.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to. Those are the readings that I'm going to share with you, or I have shared with Breen, and she can share with you. Some of them are quite old. I talk about insider or outsider issues, but actually, what I also want to do, what I want to now do, is talk about self-care strategies. And let me just see, hang on, no, yeah. Self-care strategies, first of all, for participant care. So I think the first thing for me in terms of participant care is scrupulous, paced, informed consent processes, which include, by the way, an exit strategy out of the research project. How do they get out of it? At any stage in the research, if they want to, they should be able to get out of the research at any stage, and you should also be able to facilitate that without any penalty or being fed up about it or anything else. There should be an open door out of the project at every stage for participants. Secondly, you need to explain the limitations to confidentiality and anonymity. That is a care of the participants. They need to understand fully the risks that they're taking in participation, and I refer to the Boston College case here. I think you need to agree the environment for the interview and have as much control of it as possible, but also that the participant has as much control of it as possible. Now, I've worked with film crews, so you can imagine the complications of that. And so I work with a particular film crew who actually are very unobtrusive and who will stop when I ask them to, or stop when the participant asks them to, and so on. So basically, you need to think about the environment and not taking over the participant's life, allowing them to be in charge as much as possible of the process and the environment. Interviewing people in their homes has its hazards. Interviewing combatants and interviewing perpetrators, huge issues there I don't have time to deal with. Agreeing the boundaries of the inquiry. What's off limits? What do you not want to talk about? What do they not want to talk about? What can you not ask them about? And also you modeling your own personal boundaries. Are you going to be there all night? Are you going to leave at a particular time? You have your time boundary, etc., etc. And that's important psychologically, I think, as well. And then the other thing to think about is to talk about disclosure and disclosure hangovers, not to feel that you're trying to seduce people into making disclosures, that they have an idea that the information is theirs to disclose or not as they choose, but also if they disclose, quite often when we disclose things, the next day we think, oh shit, I shouldn't have said that. Okay, and just to talk that through before you get into the interview about how that might feel the next day, or how it might feel, particularly when they go home to their families and they say, well, I told so-and-so about, you know, the situation and quite often the story that you're hearing is not just their personal story, but it belongs to a family. Back to the diagram I showed you earlier, and the family will have views about that. And I've certainly had angry families on my door the next day after I've interviewed somebody, where they were saying, how dare you stick your nose into our business, and so on. And really, I've done all the right things, but nonetheless, just to be aware that the information isn't just the informants, but it actually belongs to a family, and indeed sometimes to a community. Research that I did on Bloody Sunday, for example, belongs very clearly to a particular community. The other thing I would say is, before you begin to do this kind of research, that you do your research in terms of the agencies and the individuals who can offer support both to you and particularly to the participants, and that we make that information available. I do leaflets and leave them with the participants saying, here are the agencies, here are the people you can give a phone call to if you feel like talking, and making sure that that information is available to people and that they understand it and that they feel it's accessible. Pacing as well. Doing long interviews might be the only thing that's available, but equally you might want to pause and come back to something. I'm a great fan of humor, using humor as a way of leavening, if you like, what can be very heavy and difficult circumstances, obviously appropriately, and you don't make a laugh of things that are clearly very serious, but nonetheless being light about the things you can be light about, and of course being warm. And I was trained psychodynamically in therapeutic terms, and being warm wasn't something that we were taught to do, but I'm a believer in it anyway. So I'm not a very good therapist from the point of view of being detached and objective. I don't go with that, but that's my personal opinion. Then finally, your own self-care, and I'll stop after this. For me, skilled supervision, professional supervision is absolutely central, that you are working with somebody who knows this field, that you can actually go to, and who knows your project and can review your progress with you, and give you feedback, but also can hear what you have to say, and you can, to some extent, debrief with them, which is further on down the list. But some kind of team debriefing. When I did the large survey of Northern Ireland, we had team debriefings with people. So the researchers would get together for a cup of tea at the end of a day of field research, and we would just have a chat about what we encountered. We would talk about difficult things. Anybody who had questions or unresolved issues could deal with it in the team debrief, and that was an important support strategy for my fieldwork team. And indeed, team approaches are very important. So if you have a team, if you're fortunate enough to have a good team, the kind of support you can get from your peers is absolutely central. And pulling together, and quite often doing this kind of research coheres a team. It makes you very close to the people that you've been with in this kind of work, because it is very demanding, and it exposes emotional vulnerabilities, which makes for greater intimacy in a team. I've talked about debriefing. I think also maintaining your own personal boundaries. This is very difficult, and I'm terrible at it. You know, going home from work at a particular time, if you happen to be at home now in the lockdown, we're all at home all the time anyway, but having some kind of space where you go to get away from the work and actually stopping and going on to do something else is very important, and creating and maintaining those boundaries is extremely difficult in this kind of work, but also extremely important in terms of your own well-being and health. And you'll see in one of the pieces of writing that I've circulated that I didn't do this. In fact, I suffered. I wrote a kind of an insomniac poem at the beginning of one of the pieces, talking about the impact of the work it had on me in terms of looking at mass deaths in a conflict. And I mean, some of that is inevitable. And I think if you're going to worry entirely about your mental health, and you're averse to having any kind of disturbance psychologically, then you shouldn't be in this field, because actually, if you're a human being and you engage deeply with your respondents, it's going to reverberate with you emotionally. And all you can do is do the best you can to do self-care, but there will be repercussions for you personally. It is emotionally upsetting. If you can't be emotionally upset about it, really, maybe need to think about going into an area of work that is less emotionally demanding, because I think there will be repercussions for you, and indeed for your families. My poor family, you know, really, I don't think that, I mean, I was doing this work a long time ago when really many of these issues were never talked about and certainly not well understood. And so, I mean, I kind of learned as I went along by my mistakes very often. The other thing to do is a division of labor. So you don't do everything yourself. You actually farm things out. And Breeden talked earlier about transcribers, but I also had a quants person, a number cruncher who worked with us, who ended up also being traumatized because we worked with large databases of deaths. And he began to realize that every line on a spreadsheet was a human being who'd been killed. And we had to talk to him, but also he did the quants and I did some of the qualitative stuff, and I also did some other stuff. And we divided the labor up. Somebody else did the transcription and so on, but we had to take care of each other because each of us had effects. I think the other thing to say about trauma in general, therapeutically, is one of the therapeutic interventions for people who have been traumatized is to put them back in touch with their creativity and to engage creatively with whatever kind of outlet that they might have, or to indeed find creative outlets, such as, I mean, in my case, I write poetry and I do various paint and do various other things. But actually that idea of creating something positive in the face of the destruction that trauma causes is quite often a very healing experience for people. And it's healing for you as a researcher, so that you don't spend all your time in front of a screen looking at dreadful things, but you actually go off and sing a song or play the guitar or do a painting or do something else that actually is generative, as opposed to looking at the destruction that has been wrought by the subject that you're working with. And of course, physical exercise and leisure, which again, I'm terrible at. So I don't have to walk the walk. I can just talk the talk. That's what I'm here to do. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Marie. That was great. Thanks. It's great to have someone who's so experienced in this and has, you know, has so much to tell us. And thanks very much for being so honest about your own experiences in this. And so if anyone has any questions, we have maybe 10, or we can maybe push it to 15 minutes if we have a lot of questions. So just put them in the chat box and I'll put them to Marie there. So I don't see any there yet. So I'll start with one I have myself, Marie. You talked about participatory action research, and that's something we're using in the project that I'm doing right now. We're doing a project called OTOH, which stands for Older Traveller and Older Homeless. And we did a small, we had about 5 participants taking part. So I had a question about that, about, you know, them being co-researchers and co-analysts. What about when there's issues of capacity? If, you know, say some of the participants we would have had maybe might have issues with literacy, or just the difficulty in engaging in a research process for people who maybe don't have research experience or don't have experience in a formal learning environment. Can you speak about that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, I mean, I can. I mean, I ran the cost of the trouble study on the basis of participative action research. And what I would say is you need the resources to do it. You absolutely need the resources to do it. And it's one of the things that I'm saying, that sometimes we don't have the resources to do it, and we need to own up to that and say, right, we can't do this. And I mean, I think participative action research is one of the ways that we mitigate some of the ethical problems by doing research in this field anyway. So that's kind of a circular answer. In terms of working with populations who don't have research experience, all of the populations I've worked with have no research experience. I don't work with other research. I don't research other researchers. I don't research other people who've necessarily been to university or done a research methods course. I've researched ordinary working people. I've researched police officers. I've researched people who were in the IRA and so on and so forth. And the IRA, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a research methods course available to its members. So I mean, part of your role then becomes one of an educator. And so in order to work with people, you need to explain to them what the hell you're up to. And you have to then start getting into, I mean, dear sweet God, if I had a penny for every time I had to explain correlation, because don't forget, I was doing quants as well as qualitative stuff, you know, and why we have to do random samples, and why we have to transcribe interviews, and why all of that. I mean, you just need to get into the headspace of being very pedagogical in your approach to working with participants when you're using PAR, because they won't know. You can't expect them to know any more than they can expect you to know the intimacies of their particular circumstances. However, what I would say is that the value of using this is enormous. I mean, I learned far more by using participative action research. And I set up an organization, the board of directors of which was composed of representatives of my participant population. So I made myself accountable to a board of directors who were my participants, which was a total bloody nightmare. But having said that, I learned so much from actually doing that, of walking people through and actually learning what the limits of what I could do ethically, by actually engaging with them, sometimes fighting with them and fighting my corner. And I lost sometimes, but sometimes I won. And sometimes, and those kind of exchanges are very labor intensive. They're very resource demanding, but if you don't have the resources, you can't do it. Now, I mean, I barely had the resources. I ended up working evenings and weekends and beyond the call of duty. I wouldn't necessarily advocate that, but sometimes we're working in areas that we're passionate about, or in my case, I was working in a field that nobody else had worked in before. So, you know, I was learning as I went along. I don't know if that answers your question, Breen. But basically, and I think there are degrees as well. I mean, not everybody is as gung-ho about PAR as I am. So they do participation at different levels. I mean, I went full out participation from design, you know, right through to implementation, right through to analysis, right through to presentation. So when I presented the results of the research, I always brought participants with me. when I was going to talk to government, or when I did a lecture in Surrey University, we flew over some of my participants to co-present the research with me. But not everybody has those kind of resources. That's, if you like, if you can swing it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks very much. That definitely answers it. Okay, we have a question from Tamsil Bicknell. She says, I wonder how you manage the dual identities of researcher and therapist when you are doing research, when you're doing your research.
I don't have dual identities when I'm doing research. I have one identity, which is a researcher. I am not there as a therapist. I have no permission to consider that as a therapeutic exchange. In order to be in a therapist role, I would need the consent of somebody to be a client or a patient. And I don't have that consent, therefore it's not an issue. I do have the knowledge that I acquired as a therapist, and I would like to think that it's useful, but I think I can't remember who it was wrote about the psychological turn in social science that happened in about the 1970s. I think we need to be careful about privileging the psychological. I happen to know about therapeutic work, but it's of no particular advantage to me over and above, for example, a good working knowledge of the criminal law, or a good working knowledge of some of the other things that I might know about. I mean, right now I need to know about carpentry and joinery and painting because I'm managing a building. I mean, so there's nothing magical about psychological knowledge or indeed clinical experience. And I think we just need to remember that, because sometimes the people who have been traumatized actually need practical advice, they need financial advice, they need all sorts of other things. So let's not get hung up in the psychological, because I think that's to privilege something that is important, don't get me wrong, but it's not the only thing.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Arlene Crampsey. She says, fascinating insights, Marie. Thanks for sharing them so willingly. Why do you think there's such reluctance to consider the physical dangers of being a researcher?
Because of what I just said, I think, because there's a kind of, there's been a psychological turn. I mean, it's a very, I lived for many years in the United States, and I worked in the United States a lot. And I mean, everybody's a therapist, and everybody's worried about the psychological impact of this, that, and the other. And I mean, it's really, I think it's driven by all sorts of political forces, of course, not to mention the pharmaceutical industry and various other people who make money out of it. And the idea, and I think it's, I could go on about this all day, but basically I think we have to acknowledge that it's about psychological pain tolerance. There's somehow we've got to a stage where we're pain intolerant, both physically and psychologically. And actually pain is part of human life. And it's quite a natural and normal part of human life. And psychological pain is part of that as well. And things like grief and anger and so on are perfectly normal human emotions. And yet there's a tendency, I think, that in modern life that we medicate this away, or we try to therapize it away. And actually sometimes we just need to sit with it. So I don't know if that deals with what you're saying. I'm rambling. I'll shut up.
Okay, and we'll just take one last question. This is from Virginia Moyles. She said, I'm looking at research into the effectiveness of education in recovery from mental health challenges and trauma, and quantitative methods seem inappropriate, but management wants stats. How can we work with this? Oh,
you can work with it. It's fine. I mean, just, well, I'm in favor of mixed methods. So my advice to anybody is you start off with some qualitative work, I beg your pardon. You analyze your qualitative work. Out of that, you have some tentative findings. Turn your tentative findings into a little survey. Administer your survey, and then go back and drill down into what both the initial qualitative and the second quantitative work tells you, and do a little bit more detailed work on that. I don't know if that explains it, but basically stage the work and put quants in the middle, and it makes it easier, I think, if you're not a quants person, to do that. And there's all sorts of ways of doing it now. I mean, geez, I used to have to work with computers with the size of a large suburban house when I started work. I'm not old, you know, and we'd use 80-column cards to analyze our results. Nowadays, you can do SurveyMonkey, for God's sake, you know. There's all sorts of ways of getting around this, and it doesn't have to be very complicated. And of course, you can also do quants with your qualitative work. I mean, you can use software to code your qualitative results. So, I mean, I worked with Nudist in my day. I have my clothes on now, but never mind. Or there's Ethnograph or various other software packages that you can use to produce quants out of your qualitative work. So you can do quants. It's easy peasy.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Marie. So we're fairly on time, so we'll move on to the second speaker now. That is Ariane Markowitz. We were to have Shifa Piran as well, but unfortunately she's sick, so we just have one speaker today. So Ariane is a social urbanist and feminist researcher specializing in urban violence, participatory urban design, methodology development, and research ethics. Her doctoral thesis is at the Development Planning Unit in the University College London and is due to be finished this year. It explores the interplay between space and bodies in violent cities in order to propose a feminist methodology for working on extreme and chronic urban violence, using San Salvador as a case study. She has more than 15 years of cross-sector experience in violence and precarity in 15 countries in North and South America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. And Ariana has also found supports around traumatic research to be lacking, and in 2020 she wrote an ethics guide on navigating risk and managing well-being for her department in UCL. So although I'm framing Ariana as an early career researcher, she clearly has a ton of experience herself. So it's great to hear from her. So take it away, Ariana, please.
Thank you, Breen. Marie, I think you're still sharing your screen. I don't know if you want to, there's a way to undo that. While you're figuring that out, I'll just say that it's very exciting to be here, and to I wish that I had heard Marie's presentation before I did my doctoral fieldwork, because it would have gone about 1,000 times better, I think. As Breen said, I was supposed to present with my friend Shifra, but unfortunately, is everything okay, Marie? I think you're on mute. Let's see. Anyway, I was supposed to present with my friend Shifra, but unfortunately she's ill. What we were going to do for this presentation was last week we had a conversation about our work, just sort of kind of brainstorming ideas for how we would talk about this. And the conversation lasted like an hour and a half, and it was extremely rich and interesting. So what I wanted to do was to what we were planning to do was to basically bring that conversation here and to have it together, but unfortunately she's not here. So I'm going to speak, I'm going to see if I can kind of reconstruct that conversation a bit. But obviously, since she's not here and I don't want to speak on her behalf, I will be reflecting more on my own experience with this. Okay, so what we wanted to talk about sort of was, Shifra and I have very different disciplinary backgrounds. So Shifra was trained in psychology. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Oh, it's nice to see the faces. Thank you, Marie. Okay, so Shifra was trained in psychology, and I was trained in political science, but my work draws on human geography and sociology and anthropology and criminology, and then I'm in a faculty of the built environment, so then there's like the significant kind of design and planning component to it as well. So as we were talking, Shifra and I started talking about how we prepared to do our research, and we realized that it was very different. She being a psychologist and also having experience working in a rape crisis center, she was extremely conscientious of how she needed to have different sorts of support sort of lined up for herself, in terms of with her supervisor, with clinical support, all different sorts of things. She was extremely aware of that. Her supervisor was extremely aware of that. They continued to have lots of good conversations about that. So she was able to sort of put a system in place for herself. I've worked in violence and precarity, like Brigitte said, for a while. So I kind of, between my own experience doing that kind of work, I lived in San Salvador for a few years before going back there to do my PhD. And then, so between that and I thought that it would basically be okay to do my work. And that it would more or less go, it was obviously going to be difficult because researching violence is by nature difficult, and that's the point. And you need to be able to feel that difficulty as you're doing it. But I thought that it would be something that I could manage. I didn't have kind of a structured approach in place for managing my own exposure to trauma. And also in the reading that I did, all this reading about methodology, it didn't come up that much. You have to dig quite a bit. And I've now read Marie's research since then, but I hadn't read it beforehand. I hadn't gotten there yet because you have to get into quite a rabbit hole in order to be able to find the research where people are really talking openly about, sometimes doing this stuff sucks and it's going to damage you. And you need to know sort of how to navigate that in certain ways. But I hadn't found that work yet by the time I had started to do my fieldwork. So that was kind of the first difference that Schifra and I found. She was extremely aware of how to prepare. She had kind of a structured plan for how to do it. I definitely did not have a structured plan for how to do it. Even though both of our work, so Schifra's work, her PhD, which is at King's College London, she works on the experience of pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood for women who have experienced sexual violence. So even though both of our work, basically exposure to trauma is an occupational hazard, like Marie said. But because I think of Schifra's disciplinary background, she was much better prepared for that than I was. Then when we both sort of got into the field, Schifra is currently collecting her work. I'm near the end of, I'm writing. So there started to become questions about how to collect data and what counts as data. So one of the things that I've found is that I use empathy as a form of knowledge production, so as a way to co-produce knowledge. And I in the course of my fieldwork, I started to have, symptoms of secondary trauma, which I didn't really recognize for what they were at the time. But in trying to heal and in looking for how to make my work as transformative and just and sustainable, I guess, as I could, as I was kind of in the middle of this very difficult period, I realized that what helped me was to engage with my emotions, not to push them off, because it didn't really work anyway. So to engage with my emotions around my work, to maintain, of course, respective and protective boundaries, as Marie also mentioned, but otherwise trying to reduce the distance, so between me and the people who I was working with. So not really thinking about trying to maintain a professional or academic distance or whatever you'd like to call it. But trying to be protective, but get closer. I found that was, at least for me, it was much more healing for me. It allowed me to kind of engage with the way that I felt in a way that I couldn't without getting closer to the people who I was working with, including, even though these people, like Marie said, were complicated, most of the people who I dealt with were both victims and victimizers. And it was difficult to find kind of a cognitive model of the world in which I could hold those two conflicting realities in my brain at the same time. So that's what I found to be really useful. As I kind of explored these sorts of methods, I I was speaking with my supervisor about it, speaking with other colleagues, and I had quite a lot of support. I didn't get any pushback that, you know, I was being too close, or I wasn't being scientific enough, or I wasn't being, that the research wasn't rigorous enough or anything like that. I didn't get any kind of feedback like that. And I know, Marie, you said, I wrote it down because I had liked it. You said that being warm wasn't something we were taught to do. And yeah, I don't know if I was taught to do it or not, but it felt like it was the right thing to do, to understand and to acknowledge that, like you said, people who I was working with had experienced great pain and continue to experience significant suffering. And I felt that it was important to witness that and to recognize it and to acknowledge it. I ended up leaving a lot of probably awkward silences in the interviews and group workshops and stuff that I did, because that felt like it was right. It felt like it was a way of getting people to sort of generate their own questions and generate their own answers at the same time. And then also in terms of engaging with creativity. So as I was sort of empathizing with people, engaging with my own emotions about how I felt about what I was doing, I realized really that words were just like they weren't adequate for what I was trying to do. I would ask people questions related to fear and related to trauma, and they would usually talk in circles, or after a couple of minutes, they would say, you know, I don't actually believe what I don't agree with what I just said, sorry. And then, you know, given an opportunity to correct it, they still didn't really know how to deal with that. So I ended up working with a bunch of artists initially because I was getting a little bit desperate. And I asked people, they were filmmakers and theater people, kind of movement artists of different sorts. And I asked them to bring an example of a time where they had sought to give fear a physical form to the workshop that we did. And in the course of that workshop, they all brought different sorts of things, different, you know, clips of videos, different photos, like videos of stuff that was on stage, and having this sort of physical thing suddenly opened up the conversation in a way that I had never been able to open it before, just by sort of speaking. So I started working with people to do all sorts of artistic or embodied exercises. I did theater exercises with people, mapping and diagramming, excuse me, and drawing and all sorts of things. And through doing that, things like the conversation actually started. It worked far, far, far better. And I was very lucky, like I said, that nobody was like, oh, that's a strange sort of data, except for my dad, who is a statistician. And when I finished my fieldwork and I got home and I was visiting my parents, and my dad asked me if I'd backed up on my data, and I said I needed to find a large copy machine because I had all these like A2 papers and all sorts of things. And he was like, why do you have all these big papers? I said, you know, I did all this diagramming and mapping and I had big paper to do it. And my dad was like, would you consider that data? And like there was a bit of pushback from my dad, but look, apart from my dad, everybody was like pretty positive about what I was doing. I think when Shifa and I talked about it, she expressed a little bit of, I think hesitation maybe is the right word, that psychology, as she said, kind of sees itself as a harder science. And there's the sense that you shouldn't be, or that it's like a little offbeat or a little uncomfortable, or maybe not quite appropriate to be getting close to people, that maybe that's more of a therapeutic relationship and you need to avoid that because, like Marie said, anyway, you don't have consent to have that kind of relationship with people. So, you know, what sorts of data can you collect? What sorts of relationships can you have? So that was another kind of part of the conversation that she and I had. Then in terms of how to present that data at the end, how to analyze it and how to present it. So in my view is that if I believe that empathy is a form of knowledge production, then I need to sort of show that all the stuff that I'm writing and all the stuff that I'm producing goes through my brain and goes through my body. So after I got back from my fieldwork, I started writing pretty much exclusively in first person. Because it was really important to me that whoever was reading my work knew that this was being filtered through my lens, inescapably, no matter you know, even if I was trying to be objective and unbiased, even if I was sort of looking for that at a particular moment in the research, it was still being filtered through me. And that was just the way that it was. So I try to make that extremely clear in the way that I write, and also in the way that I speak about my work. And then I think what Schiffer was saying was that, you know, if you're looking to publish, for example, in medical journals, or different sorts of hard science journals, it's going to be it's going to be a little more complicated, maybe, to make that sort of style seem appropriate or seem acceptable or seem rigorous, and seem, you know, unbiased and objective and scientific. So she, I think, is sort of struggling with what is the right way to do this, because I recognize that, you know, I am applying obviously my own lens to my own work, but at the same time, there are certain expectations that she feels within her field that she's thinking about how to navigate right now. So I think those were the main points that we talked about. So I think what we learned from each other in this conversation, what we were hoping to share here, was that it's useful. Like, had I spoken to her before I started doing my fieldwork, it would not have taken me until halfway through my fieldwork to come up with a plan for how to manage my exposure to trauma. And the fact that, you know, since I started speaking about this kind of experience in public, so many people have reached out to me to also talk about kind of the failures in the ethics of care that their institutions have, or that they're not able to have those kinds of conversations with their supervisors, or that they're afraid of having that kind of conversation with their supervisor because maybe that would make their work feel, or, you know, people saying that they've talked about it and they were told, you know, if you can't cut it, then you should just come home. Stuff like that. Thank you, Breaking. And so, yeah, so that there's this kind of sense that there's a lot of hesitation and a lot of reservations about feeling comfortable to speak about these things openly. But since I have spoken about these things openly, all these people have like come out of the woodwork to talk to me about all sorts of random things, even though I'm, you know, not trained in mental health or anything like that to be able to navigate these things. So I think, and a lot of people told me that basically they stopped doing this type of work because they couldn't find a way of doing it in a sustainable way. So I think had, for example, Schiffer and I known each other before I started this, and had she told me, you know, in psychology, this is the sort of stuff that we do. When I worked in a rape crisis center, this was the kind of things these were the protocols that we had in place. I think I would have been much better prepared to do my field work than I was. But then I think what she expressed to me after the conversation that we had last week was that she learned a lot in how to think about what data was as she's gathering it now, and sort of the different things that she has to consider as she thinks about how to present her data when she has it together. So it was a very, like I said, it was a really rich conversation. I think both of us got a lot out of it. And it's really nice. I know that this is an extremely interdisciplinary group. And I think there's an enormous amount that we can learn from each other in order to make this work that we do that's, you know, emotionally, physically dangerous in different ways, to make it more just and more transformative and also more sustainable. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Great, thanks very much, Ariane. And again, thanks for speaking so openly and honestly about your experiences. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat box. I don't see any there yet, so I'll start with a question I had about your writing in the first person. I thought that was really interesting because in the reading group that we ran towards the end of last year, we had 7 papers that we looked at. And I don't know, it's the nature of what we were reading about, but quite often they were single authored papers. They were quite often early career researchers. And they were talking about this one particular experience of, you know, kind of trauma that they experienced in research. And they very much used the first person, you know, their own voices in these papers. And it made them very engaging. And I find that when you do read any paper, sometimes when the author kind of sometimes switches to the that voice. It makes it really engaging. And on top of that, it's like what you said, we try to frame it sometimes as kind of, you know, it's hard science, but really it does have to go through us. You know, we're not tabula rasa, you know, we bring our own experiences to this. So anyway, I wondered, you said that she first flagged that you might have pushback from journals on this. Have you ever had any pushback at an institutional level on your style of writing and, you know, maybe for chapters of your thesis or anything like that?
Fortunately, no, not yet. And I have published one thing in a journal, and the journal didn't have any issue with my writing in person. They didn't flag it or anything like that. But it was in geopolitics. So they were, if anybody's looking to publish in first person, apparently they accept first person pieces. No, I haven't had any pushback in my department from that. I've actually had really positive feedback from it, partly related to what you said, saying, okay, the writing is really engaging. It's like snappy, but then at the same time, people saying you're brave for being willing to speak about that. So I've gotten, like I said, really good feedback so far. Yeah, so far it's so good.
That's great. I see Keelan has her hand up, so I'll go to Keelan first, and then I have a question from Anne Ruel afterwards. So Keelan, do you want to unmute yourself? Keelan Barry, asked to unmute. Keelan, I see your hand up, Keelan, and you need to unmute yourself. Yeah, we should be able to hear you now, Keelan.
Hi there, sorry about that. My internet is a bit funny today. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on your self-care strategy as a researcher, and if you could give us any more tips of what has been beneficial for you.
Yes, I can do that. So one thing that I did, there was some sort of workshop that I saw by the American Psychological Association, I think. And they were talking about the fatigue points. So the point at which your desired performance continues to rise, but your actual performance just like goes down the toilet. And they recommended keeping that no higher than 80%. So that 80, and I really tried to internalize that. 80% some mornings was like, okay, I'm awake and I'm showered and that's going to be it. That's going to be it for today. And I'm going to hang out and just like chill out. Other days it meant that I could do an interview and do a focus group discussion and go to, you know, a book release at the end of the day. Like I had a lot of energy and was able to get through a lot, and that was fine. But to make sure that, you know, when I inevitably blew past my limits because things sort of went off the rails, that I had a little bit of extra in reserve to be able to manage that. So that 80% number was very helpful to me, even though it's hard to quantify exactly what 80% means. Another thing is that I had a group of kind of close confidants. Anne Ruel, who also asked the question, was one of those close confidants, actually. So she and other people who I talked to, I was able to sort of, you know, something terrible happened. And because she and others were sort of also working in similar things and also dealing with difficult things, I didn't have to be eloquent and comprehensive. I could just be like, I had a shitty day and I don't really know how to talk about it. And they would know that I was alive and I was okay. My partner, who is from El Salvador, but was not there with me, was obviously, you know, concerned about my safety. And it wasn't that helpful if you know, I was chatting with him and he could tell that something was wrong and I couldn't express it. So it was really good to sort of have a group of people who were there, who did similar work as I did in different ways, who were able to sort of hear me stumble through whatever had happened recently and know that I was okay and support me. So that was the second one. And yeah, I mean, Marie said to take distance from your work. I kind of tried to be unapologetic about taking time off. It's much easier said than done, especially when you're in another place and you have a flight back at some point and you have a clear kind of end point of what you're doing. But I tried as much as I could to take time off when I needed to and to not apologize for that. And then the last thing that I'll mention is that I did a whole bunch of grounding exercises every day. I did different things depending on what I needed. I did one of the things that I found, I had really horrible nightmares, and I dissociated a bit. So it felt like my brain was like somewhere and my body was not in the same place. So at the end of each day, I tried to put them back in the same place in different ways. So I did different grounding exercises to put them in the same place. In that single paper that I published, I wrote in depth about all of this. So I can share that with you, Breen, and you're free to circulate it if you want to. And also, if you want to talk to me about it personally, even though I'm not qualified as a therapist, but I'm happy to share experiences and share coping strategies.
Okay, thank you, Ariana. So that wasn't, so Anne didn't have a question. That was Keelan's question that she'd sent to Anne. So that's covered, Anne, is that right? Just nod, yeah.
I did have another question in the chat. I think that was Keelan's question that she had messaged to me.
Okay, so do you have a question then?
Yes.
Okay.
I can just read it out. Yeah. I'm very early in my doctoral career. I'm a first year, so I'm in some classes and think about things, and Ariana's been a really great help. So Maria said that for her, ethics and methodology had kind of like, she understood them together as one piece. And so like kind of what I heard from Ariana is that like, you're also kind of thinking about like ethics methodology and like also like kind of like the design of your research and like in your experience as a researcher, like that kind of it sounded like you're bringing that in as like maybe a third piece to something that we tend to understand separately. It's not a very clear question, but is that like, can you say more about that, or like is that a direction that you're going in, do you think?
Yeah, I wrote that down that Marie said also with like many underlines under it. Yeah, I definitely agree. Methodology and ethics are kissing cousins, as you said. It actually, in the process of sort of acknowledging that I was a player in my work, I was like a major player, obviously, in my own work, it helped me to realize at a certain point that I wasn't studying fear and trauma in a violent city per se. I was actually studying how to study a violent city. And in the course of realizing that, it felt necessary to me to make fear and trauma like critical parts of that study, because that is part of life and part of space and part of ourselves in those spaces. So in the course of sort of realizing that, what I'm doing my PhD on shifted. It has ended up becoming a PhD about a methodology for studying extreme and chronic violence, as opposed to on fear and on trauma per se.
Okay, thank you, Ariana. I think we have one more question then from Tamsin Bicknell. I think you've probably touched on this a little bit already. She says, are there any peer support groups for those doing this kind of research that you're aware of? Or is this all informal researchers with other informal relationships with other researchers? So you've spoken about this a little.
Yeah, so I started one at a certain point because I was like kind of over it being so fragmented, and all of us, we have in this field amazing institutional knowledge between all of us, but because it's not super common still that people are writing about their own experience in coping and handling stuff. And because it's a little taboo to talk about, yeah, I was really fucked up on my research, sorry. So because it's a little bit taboo, sometimes you don't know that actually everybody has this experience. And when I first started talking about my own experience and kind of tentatively asking friends who do similar work, admitting, I'm finding my field work slightly more challenging than I anticipated. Do you find your work challenging? And like, it was just a flood. People told me about their nightmares and their drug habits and their other types of substance abuse issues. A lot of people showed me tattoos that they had from moments of like particular difficulty in their work when it wasn't enough to feel it inside of their bodies. They had to be able to see it on their arm or wherever it was. So yeah, I started a group. It's not very active at all, which makes me a little bit sad, but it exists. And I know there are some other groups, and there's I presented at a seminar a few months ago, and there were some people who presented there who've started some university initiatives around this. I can try to look them up and get their names. And then I can send that along also. And I'm in another group of, there's 3 of us who are all early career researchers. And we're interested in sort of the gendered aspect of doing, thanks, Anne. The gendered aspect of fieldwork, and how to, what different sorts of identities would need in different ways for being able to do the work. So that it's related to what the question that you asked, Breen, about having the resources in order to do participatory action research effectively and well. So we're talking about, if you are a woman, for example, in the field, what does that mean for what you might need? So I personally, I didn't meet with participants who were men in social settings. I only met with them in kind of professional settings until maybe I got to know them, and there was kind of an expectation of professionalism at that point. But sometimes that took a long time because people are busy, and if they ask you, why don't you come and have a coffee with me? And I was like, I don't want to have a coffee with you. I want to meet you in your office, and I want it to be like structured and in a box right now. But so it took more time. Anyway, so I'm working with this group on we're trying to get funding right now to be able to create some mentorship networks for women in different countries and doing fieldwork stuff. But yeah, I think there are definitely some small groups, but they're pretty small, and I think many of them are often university based. But I think Twitter is helping a bit and helping people to get in touch with each other a bit more.
Okay, thank you. And Parisa, did you have your hand up to ask?
Yeah, I did. Thanks very much. And also thanks to our fabulous presenters. And special thanks to Ariana, because we went to university together. So that's how I
Parisa, I think you might have covered your speaker.
Hello?
There you go. Okay, perfect.
Did anything I said get through?
Well, you said that we went to university together, and I got excited, but then it got covered.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to say, it's quite remarkable that we're actually having this conversation at this moment, because, it's like, as someone who's been doing a lot of research on really heavy things, especially in recent weeks, I too have been having nightmares, like as in last week, like from just chronic nightmares that have been going on. So I would like to say that I support your efforts as much as I can to kind of bring all of us together and to create a network. It's also really valuable to have to share these experiences, because just some of the like individual behaviors you mentioned, like I'm recognizing them in myself, and I thought I was just like insane, like having like whimsical ideas of wanting to get a tattoo. Like I never wanted a tattoo or something. I was like, maybe there's something to this. But just regarding like institutions, do you think that how can we kind of embed more support for not just early career researchers like PhD students in our institutions, but just like kind of making the transitions into PhD, the world of PhD, like research, etc., and early like career opportunity? I don't know exactly. I think you kind of know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is getting better protocols in place. So Breen, you mentioned that at the beginning of kind of institutionalize, I don't remember exactly what you said, but it was something about institutionalizing psychological safety for researchers and also for research participants. The thing that I talk about is that everybody who's involved in research has a duty to an ethics of care. So, that means that I personally have a duty to myself to care for myself, but not in like a weird neoliberal way, like, the solution to my distress is that I need to eat fewer processed foods and like go take a bubble bath. It's like not that. So much more along the lines of what Marie was saying than like stuff that you find if you search, I'm having nightmares, what do I do on the internet? So I think that's one. So the, first, institutionalizing care for yourself. Second, kind of having, at least for me, what I found helpful was having this kind of small group of confidants who do similar work. And then I think having larger communities of practice that also do this work where people can share, like this event, which is amazing. Even though, talking about this kind of stuff amidst the craziness of the world is a little extra at the moment. I think I always learn a huge amount from these sorts of events, and I really appreciate meeting other people and hearing the strategies that other people use in order to manage their work. And then, within, universities and within research institutions, they need to account for this stuff. They have a responsibility. If you're sending somebody out to collect data, wherever that's going to be, the institution needs to recognize the risks. The risk assessment needs to include this, not in a way that's going to prevent us from doing that work, because that's not that useful either. So I think to the extent that the people who do this work can participate in the creation of these like risk management and ethics protocols, I think that's probably better. So Brideen mentioned that so my university is decentralizing the ethics protocol process right now. So instead of it being kind of at the university level, it's moving to the faculty level. So my faculty is in the process of totally revamping its ethics guidance and all that stuff. And I was asked to contribute a guide on researching and risk and well-being. My faculty is really diverse. There's, architectural historians and people who do construction work, and then there's like people like me. So I wanted to make sure that it didn't feel totally like strange and foreign to somebody who's doing conservation work in a museum, but also that somebody like me would see herself in this guide, and that there would be resources and information that was kind of relevant to all of us. So I think there's lots of different levels of change, and I think all of us can approach the different levels in the ways that we're most motivated and equipped to do so.
Okay, so that's good timing because we've just got a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to just say thank you again very much to Marie Breen-Smyth and Ariana Markowitz, our two speakers. I thought they were absolutely brilliant. So great to have the two kind of realms of expertise. Anna's giving us a round of applause there. Thank you, Anna. So we've recorded this session. I'll get it up online as soon as I can. And in terms of the papers and any extra resources, I think maybe the easiest things to try and get them up onto the information page on the ICSG website. Maybe it might be easiest to just put links to the articles there rather than me having to try and email them to everyone. Because I think that might be a bit labor intensive. So just bear with me, keep an eye on the ICSG website on the page about this seminar series. And that's where I think we'll get all that stuff. The second seminar in the series, the second of 4, is happening this day 2 weeks. So Tuesday, the 2nd of February, same time, 3 to 4:30 p.m. And our speakers that time will be Dr. Jane Mulcahy, and she's a research fellow from the University of Limerick. And then we also have Dr. Susan Power, who's head of legal research and advocacy at El-Haq, which is a Palestinian human rights organization. And the registration details for that seminar are available right now on the ICSG website. So the same page that brought you to the Zoom link to register last time. So if you go to icsg.ie and click on news, and then you'll find the page for this seminar series there. If you click in there, and you'll see the registration link for seminar 2. So that's available now. Unless anyone else wants to add anything, I will finish up in a minute. Okay, I might just